Hello. Good. Hello, everyone.
I just realized that I didn't really announce who you are. Maybe just for fun. Evan, who are you? Why are you here with us today?
Hi, I am the author of Vue.js. I am a full-time open source developer, currently based in Singapore, and I've been doing full-time open source since 2016, so a bit over 6 years now.
Nice.
And I'm super happy to see an in-person conference happening again. It's been so long. And I'm looking forward to maybe attend some myself in the next year.
Wow, we will hold you accountable for that, for sure. So how did the move work out for you to Singapore? I think you also moved during COVID times. Are you happy now? How was it? How's it going?
Yeah, I'm settled down here, really enjoying the environment. I think the good thing is the COVID restrictions kind of eased up over here. So life is kind of back to normal now. So yeah, it's really been going pretty well. Yeah.
Nice, good to hear, good to hear. So I will ask now our audience who has the first question to Evan about Vue.js. Not sure if it's a shy crowd. Come on, that's your chance. I will give you 1 more minute and have a question in the meanwhile. So, Evan, what people wanted to know is reactivity transform still experimental, and will it become stable with the version 3.3?
It is still experimental as of now, and the plan is to ship it as stable in 3.3. However, we still want to go through a round of just final discussion with the team, and just want to make sure what are the implications of introducing this. I think we are in general really happy with the design. The biggest question is because this is going to essentially introduce yet another way of writing your Vue components, and we want to think more outside just the technical aspects. We want to think a bit more about what the effect would be on beginners, new users coming to learn Vue, people searching for content online, and people maintaining existing projects. How would introducing a new way of writing things affect these situations? We want to make sure we introduce it in a way that wouldn't cause too much confusion and fragmentation. So, which is why we've been super careful with it. But the plan is, yes, it will probably become stable in 3.3.
It's good news. So, are there any questions from the audience now? I'm not that bad at throwing. I won't kick it into your face. In the meanwhile, I would have another question for you, Evan, and this is about the setup function of the composition API. So, I think most of us are aware we can use the options API, we can use the composition API, it's our choice. But what would you explain about the script setup syntactic sugar? And what would you advise to do if you want to use the composition API? Is it rather using the setup function block inside of this options API, or is it to use the script setup syntactic sugar?
So the setup function as of now should be treated as something you would only use when you don't have access to a build step. So if you're using the Vue global build directly via a CDN or using just a script tag without a build step, because in that case, you cannot use single file components, then you would have to use the setup function. But if you're using single file components and you're using composition API, then 100% you should always go for script setup. because it just makes things a lot cleaner, a lot terser. It will result in better production performance. So there's really no reason to use the setup function inside a single file component now.
Let me ask in the crowd, who of you is a script setup fan? Hands. Oh, Evan, we have a lot of people liking this. Oh, nice. Oh, give yourself a round of applause yourself. And then I missed a hand over there for a question. Oh wait, let me get the microphone to.
Precise. Should I go there?
You can speak in your box.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Sorry. The question is regarding the global state management. So up until now, we were using the Vuex as the main thing, let's say. Now Vue recommends us to use another one, pretty much the same. Unfortunately, I forgot how it's called. Pinia, yeah, exactly. But also, when the beta of the Vue 3 and the composition API was released, there were plenty of approaches how to actually create your own state with just a simple JavaScript or TypeScript file with the read-only properties, helpers, so to say, and the reactive helpers, right? So my question is, since using Vuex or this new thing is basically using a third-party plugin, dependency, whatever, is it really worth using it? Because given that we can create it by our own, what should we really use? Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, it is true that in the simplest cases, you can already do global state management with just a reactive object. You can do that, but the problem, and which is also the reason why we introduced Vuex in the past, is because when you are working with multiple developers or when you're working on something that's growing in scale, you want to have some sort of convention when you abstract state. And Vuex was kind of going the more verbose extreme, where it forces you to follow the action, mutation, state, all these conventions. So it made things a bit more verbose, but at the same time, it forces you to write your code in a certain way, right? So on the other extreme, if you use reactive objects with using just only Vue 3 core APIs, yes, you can do that, but you will have code that is that will look very different based on who wrote it. And the other aspect of it is when you move your application to say you want to now add SSR, you want to add server-side rendering, or you want to migrate your code from a client-side only app to Next.js or some environment that expects SSR. So now you kind of face a problem in that you will have to invent your own SSR conventions, how to store the state, how to hydrate the state on the client. And yet another aspect of it is how do you inspect your global state changes? How do you make it work with, say, the DevTools? How do you inspect all these changes in DevTools, right? So Vuex and Pinia both provide you with these conventions. So you just follow how they tell you to write your state management code, and you will get DevTool inspection, SSR compatibility, and also your code looks more consistent no matter who wrote it. So these are the benefits, right? So it's a trade-off, right? If you are just one person working on a tiny project, you probably don't need them. But if you're working on something that you expect to scale with multiple team members that needs to work with SSR, you want to be able to inspect all your state changes, then yes, you should use it, right? And the relationship between Pinia and Vuex is in that we were thinking about the next iteration of Vuex because the way Vuex works was a little bit too verbose after all these years. We decided that it could be simpler. Also, we want a global state store that plays well with composition API, which Pinia does. We also wanted a solution that has better TypeScript support, which Pinia also solved. So Pioneer was essentially an implementation of Vuex 5, which we designed initially. And it started as Eduardo's personal project, but as he worked more on it, we realized this is pretty much what we wanted in Vuex 5. So you should think Pioneer as the next evolution of Vuex. The reason why it's not called Vuex 5 was because it already had the name, it already had the domain name, documentation, and everything. We felt that we want to respect Eduardo's work on it, so we don't want to just take away the name and call it generically Vuex 5. And the other thing is separating the names will make it easier for users to search for them. So when you search for Vuex, you only see the old APIs, but when you search for Pioneer, you always see the new APIs that Pioneer provides. So I hope that explains the situation, but in general, so the rule of thumb is if you're just one person working on a throwaway project, you don't need to use state management. Just use whatever fits you. But if you're working on something that has a team that expects to scale, then yes, you should still use one.
He said, thank you. Yeah, behind you are a couple of lines. And while you're throwing, it won't have the micro, so everything is fine. And we have the next person. Hello.
Hi. I think my question is around Vue 2 to Vue 3 migration. A lot of us are currently building or maintaining Vue 2 projects, but then the question is, we want to shift to Vue 3 because of all the cool and fancy features, and our problem tends to be dependencies. So a lot of projects don't support Vue 3 and so on. So what would be your tip, let's say, to, like, what is one advice you can have to teams trying to migrate from Vue 2 to Vue 3?
From our understanding, yes, dependency is probably the biggest blocker, but it really depends on what you're looking for in Vue 3. For example, if you want to use composition API and script setup, it's in fact already supported in 2.7. And 2.7 should be something that's much easier to upgrade to because it should work with all the Vue 2 dependencies, right? So I would say always the first step is to upgrade to 2.7 and then start using some of the backported features to see how well it works for you. Regarding the dependencies, it's definitely challenging. From my experience, a lot of the old dependencies have, in fact, have Vue 3 replacements. They may not be a seamless upgrade, but you should be able to find alternatives that works with Vue 3 for most cases, unless you are stuck with something that's super heavy, for example, Vuetify 2, that's probably going to be quite challenging. But for smaller dependencies, say like a single component or a single utility library, I think it should be doable. So first of all, upgrade to 2.7, and then check if you can move the application to the 3.0 migration build. And then pick off the dependencies one by one. And finally, migrate fully to Vue 3. So this is the typical path I would recommend. Obviously, there will be a lot of case-by-case problems depending on what dependencies you're actually using. Some of the dependencies could really be tricky. So in the process, you may want to see which of these dependencies are real blockers that you have no alternatives. You may want to first move off of them while still on Vue 2. Then once your application is running with Vue 2 with dependencies that can be upgraded for Vue 3, then that's the moment you actually start the real migration.
He said thanks again. The mic is always off for your thanks. Yeah. Do we have another question? Over there. Okay, Evan, we have 20 lines to go. Wait a second. This will be a good throw. You can do this. Half they were, half they. And here we go. Hello.
Hello. Hey. I have a question
Hello.
about the new composition API. If you already have a code base in the options API and you would like to kind of work in tandem with this new composition API, what would be your opinion on kind of what type of components should be for options API and which ones would be for composition API? Or would you just say, no, move everything over?
I definitely wouldn't suggest moving everything over in one go. In a lot of cases, it would definitely be much more difficult, could create a lot of edge cases. I would say if you have a relatively larger app, you should allocate part of your dependency tree. For example, in a multi-page app or multi-route app, one page or one route, new features, you start using the composition API, and you can start thinking about what parts of your application can be reused or abstracted into composables, especially if you currently have mixins. Typically, you should probably migrate all your mixins to composables. Then, inside your existing options API component, I wouldn't recommend rewriting all the logic to composition API, but the first step you can do is turn mixins into composables and then use them inside your existing options API components via the setup function. But if you have a new feature, say a whole new component tree that you're just a greenfield subset of your application, you can start using script setup. And this way, you can still share logic between your new parts and your old parts in the form of composables or composition functions. Then you have a relatively clean separation. And eventually, I think if you feel that you are more productive when using composition API, then you should consider maybe migrate your old components over, but I wouldn't recommend doing that from the get-go.
Thank you, Evan. We have time for one more question. No, this was just a stretch, not a question. We have a hand over here. Hello.
Hi, thank you very much for throwing. So my question is about the reactivity transform and the script setup. With all those trends, I'm seeing more and more going into a compile time approach. So my question would be, do you think Vue is moving more into a direction of compile time optimization? So similar like Svelte, for example, is doing it?
You're absolutely correct. So Vue is always looking for ideas that can help us improve the framework. So script setup and reactivity transform are both compiler heavy optimizations. And in fact, since the beginning of Vue 3, we've already been putting a lot of effort into the compiler layer because in Vue 2, we simply compiled the templates into very plain render functions, virtual DOM render functions, that did little to no special optimizations. So the performance would be similar to that of handwritten render functions. But in Vue 3, the compiler, when compiling the templates, it actually also does a lot of interesting optimizations. For example, hoisting static trees, analyzing the static dynamic parts of your template so that on updates, it can skip and take fast paths whenever possible. We have a section on in the new documentation that actually talks about these optimizations. And these have actually enabled us to perform better than Svelte in some of the benchmarks. So we're absolutely doing a lot more compiler-based optimizations. And we've actually been doing that for quite some time now. But script setup and reactivity transforms are essentially more compiler-based developer experience related improvements. So it changes the way you write your code using compilers, right? But I think reactivity transform is probably going to be where the limit is. We're essentially pushing the limit and testing the limit a little bit with the reactivity transform. But we think script setup has been a really successful and good step in the direction. And we also have next steps that's coming up. I've talked about Vapor in a few occasions over the past few months. So Vapor is going to be a different way of compiling the templates. So it will be using a compilation strategy that's more similar to solid.js. So instead of compiling into virtual DOM render functions, we will compile into code that first instantiate static DOM fragments, then surgically bind reactive updates to these nodes. So the end result would be a little bit like Vue 1, but except that we moved most of the work to compile time. So the generated code will be doing really, really minimal amount of work. It's also quite light. And we're seeing even better performance than current Vue 3 strategy. So that's going to be something we will explore next. And there will be, even further down the line, we can think about how this can help us improve hydration performance. There are a lot of interesting things going on in the more cutting edge, newer upcoming frameworks scene. So we're always keeping an eye on those and see how we can adopt some of the great ideas into Vue. And we can do that because we are compiler based now, right? We can produce different code while your code stays the same. You don't need to learn anything new. You can write the same code, maybe even reuse your existing code, but we can turn them into more efficient code under the hood. So yeah, that's the general direction, and you're correct.
Thank you, Evan. Unfortunately, we are already out of time for the Q&A panel. Thank you so much. Have a nice rest of the day, Evan. And as we heard, we will see you next year.
See ya. Hope you enjoy the conference.